That's so funny. Anyways, no, glad you guys are here. And if you've been with us for a few weeks, then you know that we are in a study of a particular book. Oh, it's already up there. James, right? And this is, we've been going on 6 weeks now that we've been walking through just kind of in a verse-by-verse fashion through the book of James. And man, it has been a roller coaster, right? I don't know for you guys that have been in expedition groups how the conversation has went, right? There's been moments of awkward silence, and then there's been a lot of engagement over other topics in our group, right? And it's just sort of how like the book of James works. I was thinking through it this week, man, and it's like if you don't come away from the book of James with like a black eye at least, then you didn't really read the book of James, right? Like dude, he like regularly just punches us in the gut with some really like practical everyday type stuff. And he's like, dude, how are you doing in these areas, right? And we've sort of looked at those. And today we're closing that out. And so I've like given a lot of thought about how to close this book out because it's actually kind of tricky. Because if you've been following along, James doesn't have like a single narrative that he's telling, does he? He's got like all of these different little threads and these things, and he'll launch into this big like thing that's like, actually it's got theological like all kinds of like theological undergirding from other books of the Bible, things that get treatment of like chapters and like hundreds of pages, some of the topics. And James will say it in like a paragraph, and then he'll close it out with this little catchy one-liner, like you're just supposed to kind of get what's going on there. Like James really expects a lot of his readers, and for that reason, like I don't know, man, it's kind of disjointed at times. We talked about this going into it. Like, yeah, there's this big major theme that James wants us to be perfect, complete, mature, right? That there would be a unity between what we believe and how we actually live and act and speak in accordance with that. Because we say we believe all sorts of things about who Jesus is and how that affects the way that we live our life, and then we go on to do something completely different, actually, at the end of the day. And James just sort of calls these things out. And he's like, how you doing in your words, man? You follow Jesus? Yeah? How you doing with that, right? And it's like, by the way, like if you think you're just going to get control of it, you're not, right? At the end of the day, like you need something deeper, more. And then James gives us this thing that's like, dude, it's beautiful. Just talking about the words piece. But he expects that you kind of get what's going on. And so for that reason, dude, James is so hard to read at times, and at other times it's really easy. I told you guys that going into that. James is like one of the easiest, most surface level books, and it's also one of the deepest, most like, dude, it can be tough at times. And so like I spent a lot of time thinking about like how do we close and sort of wrap everything neat and tidy together. And I just thought about it, like if James were here, right, and it wasn't me, if James didn't give this as a letter, but James spoke this, and maybe we've got the letter because there was some really eager church member that was like taking every note, you know, and like doing their thing, and it's like, hey, I got the notes for the rest of y'all, right? But like, let's just pretend for a second that James was actually like giving this sermon and was going to close things out. Like, how would James do it? And honestly, man, James's sweet spot is like 280 characters or less. What social media platform uses that? Anybody? Twitter, right? All right, so you guys know me. My social media game is weak, man. Like, I am so bad. And like, I'm going to let you in on, like, a little bit of pastor envy that I have in my heart, like, because there's some dudes that are really good at this, actually. I think of Ben here in town over at Crossroads, man. Ben is on his social media game, dude. Like, every day he's posting stuff from his life. He's, like, talking about his sermon and stuff like that. It's like, Ben, dude, I wish I could do that, but I just don't want to, so I don't. And so, but Ben's really, I got another buddy. His name's Chad Graves. And honestly, like you should like totally, not right now, but maybe after the sermon, like you should look up Chad. He's a buddy of mine from Arkansas, and he's hands down the most tweetable dude in the entire planet. And I think that he started taking people serious about that because now he puts out like this, it's either a tweet or a little like short devotional. If it's more than a paragraph, that's weird for Chad, but it's like some super catchy, you know, biblical wisdom or some axiom or something, and it's like, dude, I wish I could be Chad, and I'm not, you know, there's just not no universe that I can do what Chad does. But you should definitely follow Chad because he's awesome, and I would love to get the phone call of Chad, like, wondering what in the heck all these people from Washington are doing, starting to follow him, right? That would kind of be funny, right? But as I thought about this, I spent a long time considering why James spoke the way that he did, right? It's just how my brain sort of works. Maybe that's what makes me decent at this job. I don't know. But like I asked these kind of weird questions of the text, like, why did James write this way? Like these, like he leads into this big thing, and it's like, dude, that's an amazing introduction. Where's the rest of it? And James is like, no, you get a catchy one-liner at the end of that, and I expect you to do something with that at the end of the day. And like, dude, why would you write the way that you write in these little short snippets of wisdom or whatever the case? And from a guy who regularly goes longer than he's supposed to, that was really confusing for me, actually. And because I tend to think, and you guys know this if you've hung around here, that like more explanation, more illustrations are better, right? I'm probably doing that right now, actually. And so, anyways, like as I thought about this, like why in the world would James write in the way that he does? And honestly, like I think it goes back to this. It's something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. It comes from chapter 3, verse 5. Here's what he says. James says, so also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. Right? We talked about this. Like, did the tongue conversation let the air out of anybody else's room in small group this week or like a couple weeks ago? Yeah, man, there were times during ours it was like, there's some good conversation, but there were other times where it was like, oh, it's weird. That's awkward, or it's like, man, like, yeah, you do the same thing I do or whatever, and it's like, so anyways, all right, here's the deal. The tongue is this small thing. And actually the way James leads into that from those first few verses, it's actually amoral. It's a bit in the horse's mouth, and it's not good or bad. It can turn a horse one way or other. It's a rudder on a ship, right? And you can steer that ship into an iceberg, or you can miss one with it, depending on how you're sort of inclined. But what James is saying here is that it's a really small spark that sets a big forest fire ablaze, right? And so here's the deal. When is a forest fire not a bad thing? Well, when it's controlled, right? When it's in the right area, and when it's done on purpose, with the right purpose and in the right area, then a forest fire isn't a bad thing. Actually, a forest fire can be a really good thing because it can keep worse forest fires from happening in the future. It can clear out undergrowth and dead trees and return nutrients to soil. Actually, man, a forest fire can be an incredibly life-giving thing. It's really an amoral thing. It's how we use it and how we wield this incredible power. And as I thought about this, it's like, dude, I think this is really key to why James wrote the way that he did. He absolutely understood the negative of this, but there's actually sort of a positive spin to this as well. Just think about this. Has there ever been a moment where you heard something that was like maybe a small thing, a single statement, maybe it came from a pastor, maybe it came from a tweet or some article you read or something like that, maybe a little thing that had some dramatic impact in your life? Like, just think about that for a second, right? Has you ever been in one of those positions where we heard that? I'll share one of mine that maybe will lend some credence to why James works the way that he does. When I first started out in ministry, I had a lot of questions about that, and a lot of feelings around like not being qualified for that. Like, dude, I'm not educated for this yet. I'm not like, I've never done this. Nobody in my family or pastors or anything like that. I've never been a part of like full-time vocation. Man, I served in the military for a while, and it was just like, dude, that was completely, maybe opposite of that in a lot of ways. And so, dude, I struggled with feeling qualified to do that job. And then I heard a guy make a statement that a lot of you have probably heard before. Tell me if you have, right? Like, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Have you guys heard that before? Oh, yeah, I mean, I think we've probably all heard that before. God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And here's the deal. That's not like in the Bible anywhere. It's not like a, Second Opinions chapter 4 or something like that. It's not like anywhere like in the Bible that you're going to find that verse. But I think you do see the concept of it, right? Because when Jesus came on the scene, who did he call? Well, he didn't call the Nicodemuses, like the religious leaders. He called fishermen. It's uneducated. These dudes failed out of tourist school or whatever the case, and they went into the family business. They had no prospects. They didn't have any sort of political or social connections that could have added anything to Jesus' ministry. And yet, who are the people that Jesus used, right? But check this out, even better than this, like 2,000 years later, whose writings are we actually reading? Is it Nicodemus's? We have any of his words in the Bible? We don't, actually. We got a story about him, but it ain't a good one, right? Dude, we're reading the words of these like uneducated fishermen that Jesus turned from like unqualified nobodies into somebody that he could use for his kingdom. And it's like, dude, Like, dude, I can get behind that because if God can use these dudes, then like maybe there's hope for me, right? And I still cling to this. Like, I don't want to freak you out or anything, but like I get phone calls from you guys sometimes, and it's like, hey, I have this thing going on, and I'm like, oh man, like I am not qualified to walk into the middle of this. It's like, God, you're gonna have to do something. Like, take the wheel, man. Like I'm. And dude, he's been, maybe that's not everybody's experience, but I think dude, like God has been faithful and he's shown up and he's done things like almost in spite of me over and over again. Like, dude, such a small thing. So God didn't call it qualified. He qualifies the call. Like, dude, that's tiny. But yet it's like my mind goes back to it over and over and over again. The statement has no power in itself, other than its ability to lodge itself into the forefront of our mind to produce change. You guys tracking what I'm saying? This is why James writes the way that he does, I think. I think James is like super tweetable, and I think he writes in a way that like, dude, this thing is meant to sort of stick with you and produce change over time. And so if James were here, like I practiced my social media skills this week and I figured out how to make fake tweets, and I'm so happy about that. It's so fun, actually, by the way. Maybe that's a dangerous power to put in the hands of a pastor. I don't know. But I had a blast. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to kind of take a 30,000-foot view as we fly back over the book of James. We're going to look at some of the highlights, and we're going to let James just reduce it down, man, and tweet it out for us at the end of the day. There's going to be some stuff that I'm not going to hover on because we've talked about it at length, but I think it needs to be foot stomps, right? And then we're going to talk about a few things that like James, that we haven't talked about in James. There's just some stuff 6 weeks is not enough. 10 weeks isn't enough time to spend in James, right? We need 3 months to like really dive into James the way that you need to. And so we're going to hit some of the things that we haven't touched yet, and I'll maybe hover over those a little bit longer. What I'm trying to say is going to be radically different than what I normally do, right? And that always has a tendency to go off the rails in flames, so you guys, like, buckle up, right? We're on this ride together. So here we go. So we're going to just kind of track through these different things, highlights, things that we missed, and we're going to look at these, and we're going to just allow James to sort of bring it in together for us at the end of all these teachings. Some of them I'll spend time on, some of them I won't. Everybody good? Ready? Buckled in? Here we go. All right. James 1:13-18. James says this. He says, let no one say when he is tempted. It's one of those things that we didn't really talk about a whole lot, right? Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved children. This is a term of endearment, man. Like James is trying to warn his children in the faith of something that, like, man, they are in danger of falling into this trap because he's watched it happen, and guess what? We are too, right? So he says, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. That I wish we had like an entire week just to spend on that. In the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. So just if you weren't here or if you weren't tracking what was going on before this in chapter 1, James talks about trials. And the way that we see our trials is really, really important, right? If we're going to have a unity between our faith and our works, the way that we claim to believe and how we actually live, then one of the things we need, one of the three main things, right, that we need to do that is trials. And the problem is that we see our trials the wrong way, right? It's like, dude, trials are terrible. And yet James tells us to take joy in those because out of that comes this like fullness of character, like the refining of the deepest, most inner parts of who we are into this very, very precious thing. But there comes these moments, whether it's trials, he even says it's trials, or maybe it's those moments where you get to make a choice between like letting God to define good and evil for you or defining it for yourself. Like, don't be mistaken. Like, God didn't, two things. God didn't send the trial, and he isn't the one tempting you, but he's absolutely big enough to see you through it. And I think this is it. Trials and temptations are not sent by God, but he's big enough to see you through them if you love him more than you love your sin and trust him more than you trust yourself when negative circumstances arise. Here it is, tweet format. You guys ready? It's the first one. I'm so happy about this. Yeah, so up there, man. Here it is. God didn't send the trial you're in, but he's powerful enough to use it. Perhaps the greatest thing God can offer us in our trials isn't deliverance, but maturity in the opportunity to grow in faith and love for God. Hashtag shift your perspective. Hashtag you're good in His glory. What do you guys think, man? That great? Dude, at Servant James. Yeah, so I had way too much fun with the power of the fake tweet this week. So anyways, there's a trial run. That's going to be kind of how it goes this morning. You guys good? You guys good with that? We're just going to move through some things. All right, here's something else from chapter 1 that we need to take another look at. 1, 9 through 12. He says, but the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position. Something doesn't make sense in this, right? Humility doesn't typically equal a high position, right? And yet, James is saying that it does here. And the rich man is to glory in his humiliation. That really doesn't make sense, right? Because like the flowering grass, he will pass away. It's got really dark. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too, the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. There's that theme again, right? For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. I think James, I told you guys really early on in the series that James didn't really write anything new. James actually comes under a lot of criticism by scholars because James actually doesn't give us any new information. Pretty much everything that James gives us comes from either like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. A lot of stuff comes from Job, the old minor prophets, and a lot of it comes out of Jesus' teachings, primarily the Sermon on the Mount. Like James is just sort of like me. He was like definitely not creative, right? And well, maybe not because he was tweetable. But anyways, but I think this really echoes what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19, verse 23 through 24. He says, Jesus said to his disciples, truly I say to you, it is hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. That's maybe like bad news if you're a rich guy, right? Again, I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. And here's the deal. That's true, but not in the literal sense. Because in the literal sense, it's actually no harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a poor man, right? It's repentance. It's trust in Jesus, man, and it is a desperate cry for Jesus to save and to deliver you, right? Those are the three elements. You need those for salvation, right? We talk about that like all the time. But the problem is that riches make that trust piece a little bit harder, right? Because here's the deal. Like it's hard to trust God in something that you can't see. Although that's kind of crazy too, because the last I checked, like death rate for humanity was still sitting at like 100%, right? But for some reason, it's hard to trust in something that you can't see, right? When you can actually trust yourself for the immediate and tangible needs of everything else in your life. Like, dude, you don't have to lean on anybody else for that trust piece in any other area for your life. And so all of a sudden now, like your eternal soul, like to lean on somebody else, that's wildly out of character for someone who is rich and who's wealthy, man. And just so you know, if you're sitting in this room or listening to my voice on some sort of like digital device, you're rich. You're in this category, right? And here's the deal, like, but for a poor man, for a man whose needs are always the most primary thing right in front of them, like, dude, it's cold. I need a jacket. I'm hungry. I need to know where I'm going to get my next meal. Like, dude, it's raining outside. I need somewhere to sleep tonight. Like, dude, your needs are always in front of you. So that trust piece is a little bit easier to come from, actually a lot easier to come by for a poor man. It's just what Jesus and James are saying, right? And here's the deal. Like, don't place your hope in earthly riches because they can evaporate in an instant. Dude, it's an illusion. Like, dude, your ability to trust yourself for these things is this illusion that we give ourselves to this lie that at the end of the day, dude, it's gone like that. It could be gone tomorrow. Here's how James tweets it out. You want too little. Quit striving for earthly riches when only heavenly ones will truly satisfy. One will rust before your eyes, and the other is an eternal crown of life. Love God and be rich. Love riches and lose them both. Hashtag truly rich. Yeah, I think it's how hashtags work, right? I don't know. Anyways, all right. Chapter 2. You guys moving on? That's chapter 1. You guys good? We're going to get through this actually pretty quick today, I think. Was that no? I don't think so. Thanks. I do. And we never do, but I've got extra motivation today. So yeah. All right. So James is going to tackle a couple of issues that elsewhere in the Bible receive literally hundreds of pages, and we're going to try to summarize them down into a tweet, right? And so here it is, James chapter 2, verse 1. My brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. That is to say, do not claim to follow after the way of Jesus and proceed to treat people differently based off of what you stand to gain from them. And then James goes on and he tells us this story about a rich man and a poor man who show up at a church service, right? And it's like the rich guy gets the leather couch, which nobody sat on today, but like the rich guy gets the leather couch and he gets this special treatment. And it's like, oh, brother, let's take you out to lunch afterwards and whatever the case is. Want to hear your story. And then the poor guy, it's like, hey, Mike, keep an eye on that guy. Don't let him steal rolls of toilet paper or something, or whatever, like make him sit at the back. It's like, dude, we actually do this all the time. We categorize people based off of what we stand to gain from them, and then we treat them differently based on that, right? And here's the deal, like, dude, this is the antithesis of how Jesus loved you. And if you're following after Jesus and fail to love people the way that he did, are you really following, or are you just claiming to follow after? Here's a tweet, man. Jesus didn't stand to gain anything by loving you. In fact, it cost him everything. His love was based on who he was, not what you could do for him. Follow-up question. What if Jesus loved you the way that you love others? Man. Yeah, I don't know, man. I think we need to let that one sit for just a few seconds. James 2, 9 through 13. He goes on. But if you show partiality, you're committing a sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. All right? So here's the deal. James needed to spell that out because his people didn't get that, right? They were treating people differently based off what they stood to gain from this a little bit further down in that chapter. And James needed to spell out like, hey, actually, that's wrong. Don't do that. That's really bad, right? That's actually breaking God's law. I know it isn't spelled out directly anywhere in the Torah, but like that's against God's law of loving your neighbor, which he's going to say here in just a second, right? He says, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he has become guilty of all. But for some reason, you've convinced yourself that you're actually not guilty of breaking God's law, so let me spell it out even clearer for you, he says. For he said, do not commit adultery. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do commit murder, you've become a transgressor of the law. So speak and act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be merciless to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. There's that little tweetable one-liner to close that out, right? Here it is. James is saying that the root of our favoritism and judgmental attitude stems from a falsely derived attitude of superiority. And when we judge people based on that, our judgments will always be merciless. That we can somehow view ourselves as superior and convince ourselves that like, dude, no, I'm justified in treating the people around me the way that I'm treated, right? Because they got themselves into that situation, right? Like they're their own worst enemy in this, and I'm not doing anything that nobody else would do or think or say to them in the same situation. And James said, no, you're wrong, man. Actually, like, dude, you're a transgressor. And when you set yourself up in this sort of moral superiority, dude, your judgments will always be merciless. They will always be without grace. They will always be harsh. James looks back at Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount and says, no, man, if you have hatred in your heart, you're a murderer. If you look at a woman with lust, you're an adulterer. You've broken the law, man. And when we go on to judge someone with favoritism and others we judge in harshness and without mercy, like, dude, we're always going to judge them more critically than we would if we had a proper evaluation of our own heart and our own standing before God. Here's the tweet, right? It's this: when your false sense of moral superiority causes you to judge your neighbor without mercy, you stand convicted by the same measure of judgment. You've never experienced Jesus' mercy and forgiveness if you won't extend it to others. That is to say that true mercy and forgiveness cannot simply be conjured up on our own strength. You ever tried that? You ever tried to just like forgive somebody who like legitimately did something needing forgiveness? How easy is that? Right? You ever been there in that place? Yeah, it's not super easy. And it's like, dude, you will never conjure up the strength just by white knuckle it out and to forgive somebody like for this thing. Like, dude, Real mercy, real grace, real forgiveness only comes out of the overflow of that which has already been extended to you through Jesus. We doing good with that? We good? All right, let's move on. I know it got like kind of funny to really heavy really quick, and so don't worry, it only gets worse from here on out. So we covered chapter 3 in detail, but I think there's something that needs to get foot stomped. Like in fact, we'll never talk about this enough here at the Outpost, and that's the way we use our tongue. Everybody good with that and how we use our language? Yeah. Here's what he says, 3:8-12. He says, no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who've been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? No. Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Again, no. Nor can salt water produce fresh. We've talked about this already just even a little bit this morning, right? We carry an immense power through our words. And even the smallest thing is enough to spark this forest fire of problems. And here's what we talk. This is what we really like kind of uncovered in our group. Is like a few of us has been burned by those forest fires, right? A few of you guys, you said something, it's come back to haunt you, or like you're aware of the destruction that word, that sentence, that thing caused, and it may be years down the road before it ever surfaces again and it causes the problem it's going to, right? But here's what James says, man, to try and control that, dude, is a failure. You're going to fail every time. I gave an example of 2 political figures that are like low-hanging fruit for people, right? You guys remember who I said? Who did I give you guys examples of? Joe Biden and Ted Cruz, right? Both those dudes got enough faux pas in like media and personal life and all that stuff that like, dude, they are low-hanging fruit for the left and the right? And what happens is like all of a sudden we will begin to like spew these things about one of those guys, and it's just like, controlling your tongue will say, nope, I don't need to do that. Keep that in, right? That's not right. That's critical, right? That's like demeaning. That's wrong. That's whatever the case, right? And so I don't need to say that. And so you'll keep it inside you, but what happens, man? The inside of your heart is like this echo chamber that it just reverberates and gets louder and louder and louder and louder. And at some point, you lose the battle, don't you? Yes, you do. It makes its way on the keyboard or on the phone, or you say that thing. Maybe it's just like you wait for a better opportunity full of a group of people who agree with you about that subject, right? But you eventually are going to lose that battle. And I said, man, to control your tongue is like trying to tame a lizard, man. You're not going to do that. That's the example that James gives us, right? So people don't do that. No, you will always fail. You need to fundamentally see those 2 men differently, and the only way to do that is with a transformed heart. And the only power strong enough, capable of doing that, is the gospel. Here's what James says. James tells us that when we communicate with others, that what we communicate with others is the clearest indicator of what's going on in our hearts. To simply try and be more pure in our speech is an impossibility. Right? Here's the tweet. He says, controlling your tongue is like trying to turn a cruise ship with a canoe paddle. It's pointless. You don't just need a better rudder. Your heart needs a new captain. The tongue is controlled by the heart, and a heart controlled by Jesus has a controlled tongue. Hashtag tongue twister. That's definitely real, right? All right, moving on. Chapter 4, we'll move on to chapter 4 now. Yeah, chapter 4. There are 2 things worth looking at. One we covered in detail last week that we need to hit again, and one we haven't talked about yet, right? Here it is. First one comes from 4:1-4. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Right? Underline, circle those words in your Bible if you do that sort of thing. And then draw a line over to the words pleasures, because that's the source, right? Pleasures that wage war in your members. You lust and you do not have, so you commit murder. You're envious and you cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. And even when you do ask, you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your own pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. give you guys an example of a horse that we used to own, man. And we didn't know anything about raising horses. And so when we got this horse, it started like literally eating the barn away, man. It was like every piece of wood that it could get its mouth around, it was like, taking bites out of this thing. I didn't know animals like took bites out of wood, but dude, this thing was like eating the gate off of our barn. And we talked to somebody who did know something about horses, and he said, oh, dude, he's mineral deficient. You need to get a mineral block out in the pasture for him. And we did. And guess what, man? He stopped eating the barn, right? And it's because he has this like desire, he has this need for nutrients and minerals and all that stuff, and he wasn't getting that. He wasn't receiving that from a proper source. Maybe if he had a big pasture or something, he could have got that from the food, but he didn't. Maybe we weren't feeding him right. I don't know. We weren't good at taking care of horses, and we eventually got rid of them. But yeah, so but when he didn't have that, he had to gratify that need somehow, and he did it in a destructive way. And so that's what we do, man. We go on a warpath through like seeking our own pleasure in the pursuit of self-gratification. And God has like put those things in us, man. Like they're all good God-given needs. And He has a way, He has an avenue through which they're meant to be satisfied. And yet when we jump the rails and we do it our own way, dude, it's destructive. There's this quote by C.S. Lewis that maybe a few of you guys have heard before. I'm going to read it. I can't remember if I put it on the screen or not. It comes from Mere Christianity. Here's what he says. See, the Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably, earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or to be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for something else which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it my main object of life to press on to that country and to help others do the same. Dude, I love C.S. Lewis, man. Another tweetable dude, right? I don't have anything to add to that. It's gorgeous. And so here's the tweet. And does your pursuit of pleasure outpace your pursuit of Jesus? See the conflict in your life for the answer to that. Wow. Yeah. Hashtag I emoji. I don't think that's how emojis work, James, but glad I didn't write that. That was totally James. All right. 13 through 17. Here's what he says. This is the part we didn't cover. He says, come now, you say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you don't know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are a vapor. You're here for a little while and then it vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, then all such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it's sin. There's another little tweetable moment for James, right? Here's the deal. In those short 5 sentences, this is James beginning his conclusion. Don't let the fact that it's in chapter 4 sort of mess with your head. But James is, in those short 5 sentences, James has hit just about everything that we've talked about so far. If you have your Bible in front of you, like just take a second and see if you can see it, right? James hits our words. What do we say? We're going to go to this place or that place. We're going to do this or that, right? He hits our wisdom. He hits our arrogance. He hits our pursuit of pleasure, our pursuit of riches, even in the reality that it can all evaporate before our very eyes. And it's, dude, James hits it all. This is like every big thing that we hit so far, right? And here's the deal. This has echoes of like Ecclesiastes and mainly like Job's story. Look, do you like Job's story? It's kind of weird if you do, but I won't judge you for that. It is a good story. I'll tell you that, man. But if you don't know Job's story, Job was like super rich guy, big family, sons and daughters and son-in-laws, daughter-in-laws, man, thousands of sheep and goats and cattle and camels and, dude, everything you can imagine. And dude, one day he's standing out there just kind of looking over everything that's going on, and all of a sudden somebody comes running. Marauders, they've carried off all the camels, right? And dude, and all the sheep are dead, and all the cattle, they've had sickness or whatever the case. I can't remember what they are, right? And it's just like, dude, I mean, all of a sudden Job just sees like all these different servants coming over the hill, and he's like, oh my gosh, right? And then one comes, and it's like all your kids were throwing a party, and this windstorm came, and it blew it down, and everybody died. And dude, Job just like, he just lays down on the ground, just covers his head in dirt, and he's just like, dude. And his friends are terrible in the story. If you've read the story, it kind of sets us up, the beginning of the story, that Job was actually a blameless dude. Like Job was like living in humility, walking in step with God. Like, dude, Job was a good guy. And yet for like chapter after chapter after chapter, you hear these like sleazebag friends that are like casting blame on Job, that you kind of start to like wonder yourself. You're like, dude, is there a trustworthy narrator in this? Like, Job, are you sure he didn't do anything, man? Because like this is bad. This is bad. Even his own wife is like, dude, just curse God and die. Dude, I mean, like, she was the best, right? And then he's like, his health goes. And you just realize that, like, Job's got some questions for God. He does, man. Job has some strong language, but he also knows that God's got some broad shoulders and he can handle it, right? Job never gets an answer. You think about that in the story? Job never knows why all that happened. Life was going good. There was this perceived trajectory to Job's life, and all of a sudden, one day, to no fault of his own, dude, it just disrupted. To think about tomorrow with such certainty and hope is an indicator of pride, and it sets us up for some major, major letdowns. The truth is, your story could be Job's story, and you just don't know it yet. I'm going to leave that one there for just a second. I think it's actually up there. Your story could be Job's story. You just don't know it yet. And that's brutal, man. We all live in this sort of low-level pride where we've sort of mapped out this trajectory for our life. Maybe to not do that to some extent would be unhealthy and would be, that would be wrong, and you would set yourself up for failure in that way, right? But what happens is we begin to really place our hope and our trust. We begin to root our identity in this forward future trajectory of our life, and we say, dude, this is what it's going to look like. And, barring any like major mess ups on my part, like this is where we're headed. And then what happens is in those trials, right? James talked a little bit about those. All of a sudden now, just like your riches, this thing is shown for what it is, and it's an idol. It wasn't part of the plan. I was thinking about in the Dark Knight series, Heath Ledger's Joker has this quote, and he says, he's talking about Batman and Commissioner Gordon and all these people. He said, man, they're all schemers, right? They'll run around. They got their plans and stuff like that. He said, do I look like the man with a plan, the Joker, and he's got like a wig on, and he's looking all crazy. And he said, no, man, I'm like a dog chasing a car. I wouldn't know what to do with one if I caught one, right? He said, I just do things, right? Like if tomorrow I were to tell the world that a bus full of soldiers was going to get blown up, nobody would bat an eye. Why? Because it's part of the plan. What if I were to say that one little mayor or city commissioner or hospital is going to get blown up? Man, everybody loses their mind because that's not part of the plan. Side note, do you know the Joker actually has a superpower? Do you know what it is? Anybody know? Dude, come on, I got to have one Batman nerd in here. No, you don't want to say. Do you know the Joker's superpower is actually super sanity? Dude, Joker's actually so sane that he looks insane to the rest of us. And I think there was a moment right there where he sort of hit on it, right? I shared a story this week on my Facebook, which is like very rare for me. But I did share a story this week. And it's from a lady down in Vancouver, Washington. And she tells a story about our son who was in college, and man, everything was going good. Like, he was on the debate team, he was headed places, man, making the grades, dean's list, everything was going great. And then one day, he lost his mind. I mean, like, literally, like, he went psychotic. Legal diagnosis, psychotic, manic depressive, schizophrenia. Zero signs, zero symptoms, nothing leading up to this being the case. Like everything was fine, and then one day, it wasn't. It wasn't fine. And then he came home, and within 6 months, he had packed up his bags and said that he was going to just drive off, and that it was going to be the energy from the universe that was going to keep his car going. And he got to about Burien, and that didn't pan out that way. She said maybe one of the most heartbreaking moments of this entire story is he was living on the streets up in the University District of Seattle, and called her one night, and just this moment of lucid, he was present. He was wrapped up in a tent, and he lost the tent poles, but it was cold outside, he was wrapped up in this tent. She said, man, I cried myself to sleep because that's the tent that we used to take the family camping with. And, dadgummit, man, I would cry about this. But she said, I knew that he wouldn't get help. Like, no psychiatrist or psychologist wanted to touch him because he's a legitimate need. Right? They're cool with like helping your anxiety or depression or whatever, but like stuff like this, and this is the breakdown. That's what the article was sort of about. It was like the breakdown is like legitimate mental needs, like here and say, like, dude, they don't want to touch it. She knows that the only 3 avenues for him to get the sort of help that he needs, and even then it's going to be a shot in the dark, is if 1, he's on the streets, 2, he ends up in jail, or 3, he makes a serious attempt on somebody else's life or his own life. Those are the only 3 ways that this young man is going to get the help he needs. And so she goes on this warpath, advocating with like people and it's all stuff. And she's in a room with a bunch of senators from here in Washington and the governor, and she gets the phone call that he jumped off a building, killed himself. Man, dude, here's the deal. That could be you or me 6 months from now. It could be your story, and you just don't know it yet. You have this trajectory mapped out for your life, and all of a sudden now we root our identity in this thing, and this is the thing that gives us purpose and motivation. It's what gets us out of bed. It's what moves us into relationships with certain people and away from others, and it's what causes us to treat people differently based off what we stand to gain from them and use our language in ways that burn the people down around us, right? And yet, dude, you're not assured of this trajectory. That could be you 6 months from now. Your family's left you. You've pushed everyone away. Dude, I'm here every day. I set up that desk every day, man. And I was on the phone with Danielle just last week, and some guy comes by and he's just cussing, screaming, fighting the demons, man. Danielle's like, what was that? I was like, it's one of the guys just walking down the street, Dude, it could be me. It could be me. 6 months from now. To put our hope in some future trajectory that we have mapped out, right? Let me say, to think that it could never be me, and to place your hope in certainty of some perceived life trajectory is the destructive pride. Here's the tweet. Man, you can roll the dice by putting your hope in an imaginary tomorrow, because that's what every tomorrow is. Or you can put your hope in God. Both are unseen, but only one can give guarantees. Chapter 5. I'm not going to reread chapter 5 because Miss Becky did a fantastic job with that. Thank you so much, by the way. But if you have your Bibles, chapter 5, 1 through 6, you can open that up. 5, 1 through 6 is about these little injustices that we perpetuate for our own benefit and how they rot our soul away and heap up judgment from God. We do this in like 1,000 different ways. I'm not going to go into that. Pick any one of our other YouTubes at random, and you'll hear some way that I say that we do this, right? Like, this is a regular conversation that we have here at the Outpost, right? We do this. And that's not really the point. James isn't really making the point that we do this. James is really making the point that we do this because there's seemingly no consequences. That the people that we've oppressed in our fields, they cry out against us, but there's nobody to hear us, and so we continue to do it because we stand to gain from it, and nobody's listening. James says, dude, no, somebody's listening. Right? I want you to think like early 1800s. Think like slavery here in the United States. Dude, it existed because what happens if you cry about the injustices that are being levied on you? Well, there's only 2 people that are going to hear you, and that's 1, your fellow slaves, and they don't have the power to do anything, or it's the cruel masters who are benefiting from your oppression. And are they going to do anything about it either? And it was like, no. Like, and here's the deal. Actually, it didn't get any better until a couple of things happened. They started imposing like some serious taxes and levies on like goods and services that came at the hands of slave labor. And so they stopped making it beneficial for people to leverage other people in injustice for their own financial gain, right? That didn't really work. And so the only other thing that really made it work is an army from the north that marched against them and said, no, we hear your cries. We're coming after. And I know that's incredibly reductionistic, and I know there's a lot of other like elements that go into that, but like here's the deal. It only ended because like somebody else heard and they came in and they did something. And then again, the same story in the 1960s. And then again with women's rights, and the list goes on and on and on, but those are just sort of the major ones, right? But I said that we actually do this all the time in 1,000 little ways. We use people. We posture ourselves in the way that we look, and we affect people's perception of us, man. And it's just like, dude, that's not fair. That isn't true to who you are. And yet, like, we do that to curry favor or to position ourselves with people who matter, or whatever the case is. And we do this all the time, 1,000 little ways. And we get away with it because we think at the end of the day, nobody really knows. Like, nobody really knows what's echoing around in my heart that caused me to live and act and say and do that thing. Dude, no, not true. James has been talking about humility up to this point, right? So here's the tweet. Humility doesn't assume its rightness. Humility is the key to this. Humility is the thing that destroys this. And humility doesn't assume its rightness first. Humility assumes God's rightness and whether its actions love God and neighbor before itself. Hashtag there is nothing unseen. Chapter 5. Justice, man. Dude, James hits it all, man. It's awesome. So good. I love James. And here's how James sort of concludes everything. 7 through 20 is James's conclusion. But before we go that, I want you look at me real quick. Don't look at your notes. Who in here could like tell me what all the tweets were? Anybody? Like verbatim. Anybody good with that? How many were there? Don't look. Not you. You're looking at notes right there. How many were there? 7? Nope. That's wrong. Nope. There's been 8 so far. 8 tweets. Anybody remember what? Could you quote for me verbatim what the second tweet was? Don't look at your notes. There's a couple of people looking down there. Quote. What's that? It's one about riches. That's good. That was going to be my next question because I knew nobody was going to get the first part of that. So my next question was like, what was the topic of the second? Anybody raise your hand if you knew the topic of the second tweet. Said 1. Man, okay, so statistics say about 5 or 6 of you should maybe remember what the second tweet was, right? And here's the deal, right? And this is like abysmal. These are numbers that pastors don't need to look at on a Monday because they're so bad, right? Here's the reality. This is the point I'm trying to make by this. You're going to forget 80% of what I said by the time you stick your key in the ignition in the car. Yep, about 8-10 minutes, it's 80% of it gone. And that's if you took good notes. I ran off 30 copies of notes. I think they're all gone. There's about 60 of you in here. Half of you are going to forget 95% of what was said before you get to your car. That's today. Dude, the numbers don't look any better for the rest of the week, right? They get worse and worse and worse. And as a pastor, you just can't think about that too much, right? And here's sort of like, here's the deal. Here's the point I'm trying to make by this, is it's too much, man. Dude, James is like, I told you, James is winning 1,000 different directions, and they're all great. They're awesome. We just looked at a few of them this morning that we've hit before. They're amazing, life-changing things that if our society would get these, dude, we would live in a different world. They're amazing. And yet, it's too much. You cannot live with all of these things rotating through the forefront of your mind at all times. Like, what would your life even look like if that was the case, right? Like, okay, you wake up and your feet hit the ground and it's like, okay, here's what I'm doing today, but don't put my hope in the trajectory of today, right? And it's like, dude, I got to be sure and like, got eyes on you, and you get dressed, you get downstairs and your little gremlins come to talk to you and you haven't had your coffee yet. And so it's like, okay, words inside, God, be the captain of my heart. And, it's like, dude, you cannot go through life this way. It's impossible. You can never remember all of these things. And here's the deal. Like, you need to know them. That's why we spent 6 weeks talking about them. That's why I spent like over 100 hours in sermon prep and trying to deliver this in the most memorable way that I can, is because James says that you need to know this. No, don't be like the man who looks at himself in a mirror and then goes away and immediately forgets it, right? Like, no, you need the word deeply pressed into you. This is the bottom part of chapter 1. You need it deeply pressed into your heart. You got to know these things. You just can't keep them all in the forefront of your mind all the time. That's impossible. James says, I don't need you to. I need you to keep one thing in mind. Here's that one thing. James 5:8. This is how he closes it out. He says, you too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. He's coming back soon. Let me show you how that works. Our tongue. That's sort of been the highlight of the series. For good reason. It's a big topic, right? I said last week that we think, or a couple weeks ago, we think temporally, God does not. We rarely, if ever, see the full outworking, the destruction, and the fires of our tongues. We'll say a thing. I gave you guys an example. I said, maybe it's that careless word that you say in front of somebody who is maybe considering becoming a follower of Jesus, and yet they heard that thing and they said, well, dude, if that's what being a follower of Jesus means, I'm out. I'm not into that. And maybe, and you don't know this, but maybe they were the one that was going to lead their spouse to Christ. And maybe the two of them were going to lead their children and their children's children's children. And you have damned an entire line of people because of a careless word that you said and you had no idea. But hey, man, Joe Biden or Ted Cruz, they suck, right? So we said it. And it flew out there into space and people heard that thing. And all of a sudden now it's like, do we have people that are watching us? And we are followers of Jesus. And so if that's what it means, I'm out. How do you know? Do you know that that's not the case? You don't. I don't. We have no idea. You will. You will, man. There's coming this day. And I need to preface this. You guys know me. I'm not hellfire and brimstone. I think fear is a very poor motivator, and so I try not to use that. That's not this. I just want to faithfully communicate the concept that James is trying to get across here. So on that day, man, you're going to stand there in full view of this. There's kind of two views about Judgment Day. One says that if you're a follower of Jesus, you just kind of get to skip all the unpleasant stuff and you get to go to the end of the line, and in the gates, right? That's legit. That's one view. And legitimately, I've grown up for a very long time believing that. Do you know what that's based off of? It's based off this one verse. It's there's now no condemnation in those who are in Christ Jesus. And from that, as sort of a root verse, that they go and we sort of take all these other things, and it's maybe so. Maybe so. But let's just assume, and if that's how you've sort of grown up thinking, let's just assume for a second that's not the case, right? You're going to stand before God one day. I'm going to stand before God one day. There's going to be this moment where the layers of reality are just peeled back and you get God's view. You see the forest fires just from an aerial view and the destruction that they've laid out, right? That's just your words, man. That's not the grabs for pleasure. That's not the ways that you've perpetuated injustice. That's just your words, man. All the rest of it comes too, right? And in that moment, one of two things is going to happen. You're going to be silent in both of them because there's just your guilt. It's going to be undeniable. You won't be able to say anything, man. And in the first scenario, your silence will condemn you. And that's it. After judgment comes condemnation, right? After the evidence is produced, then comes judgment and condemnation. That's scenario 1. In scenario 2, you still have your mouth shut. But somebody beside you says, I paid for that. Paid for that. Yep. Yeah, they did that. And I felt it. Died for it. Penalty. I paid the price. It's paid for. Next item. What's up next? Oh, and by the way, the forest fires were considerably less than they would have been had they continued on their own trajectory. But man, they really did. They moved their eyes on me. They followed after me. The forest fire damage is considerably less than it would have been. In fact, look at the things that did come out of their words as they submitted themselves to allow me to work through them. Look at the new growth and the life that came out of their word. Look. But I paid for it. Next item. Pleasure? I paid for that. Injustice? I paid for that. Penalty? It's been taken care of. Yeah, they're guilty, but I paid the price. Those are 2 options, man. And you can't keep all these things running through your mind all the time. But you can keep that thing. And I think if James was going to close it out with a tweet, this is how you do it. He's coming again soon, so yeah, you got to reckon with that, man. And what happens is that view of like judgment drives people into one of about 3 or 4 different places. Drives people into repentance and trust and cry for salvation. That's where it drives some people, and that's the opportunity that lies in front of every person this morning. Like, is that? And in some people, it leads them into disbelief, rejection, and not just regular rejection, but like outright militant rejection, man. If that's what God is, then I want no part of it. I've been a good person, and I'm going to assume that I'm going to be judged by a jury of my peers. No, you're not. You're going to be judged by an infinitely holy God, man, whose ideas and whose inclination of right and wrong, good and evil so far supersede your own that it's not even funny. He's coming again soon. So I told you guys, man, I'm not the hellfire and brimstone kind of guy. So I'm going to leave it there. Like, he's coming again soon, so your words matter. Matter a lot, man. The gospel needs to do some work in your heart because you're never going to control them. It's coming again soon, so the way you treat people matter. They're not your enemy. There is an enemy. They're just not it. They're someone who's been created in the image of God, who He loves and who He died for. That's who they are. I need you to see people that way. He's coming again, so if you dump 95% of this, let that be the one thing that travels with you. I don't know where you're at. I don't know what you need to deal with or how you need to take that and reckon with that, but man, I'm here. In fact, not just me, there's multiple people here that would love to talk through that. And maybe this is the first time you've ever heard this message, and maybe you need to cry out in repentance, trusting Jesus for your salvation. Maybe you can do that right where you're sitting. I'm going to give you some prayer or something, because it isn't about that. It isn't about some list of words or some magical, like string of words that makes that happen. No, it's you genuinely realizing that, man, I've defined good and evil for myself, and that's not working out so great. Jesus, I need you. Forgive me, save me. That easy. And that's the same thing, by the way, that you go back to over all of these other issues as well. Dude, I can't control my words. I'm sorry. Jesus, I trust in you. I need you to do a work in my heart over this issue that I can't do myself. All of the above. You guys good? You guys good with James? What about James, man? Dude, James is awesome. Love James. All right. Well, guys, we're going to close. You're right. I totally did not get us out of here early, so I must stop saying that. So I'm like tired of making a liar of myself every week. So if you guys are cool with it, we're just going to do our thing every week. And yeah. All right. Well, let me pray, and we'll close it out. Father God, we love you. Father, we just thank you for the promise that you have not forgotten us, that, Father, you're on your way back. You're coming again for us. Father, I pray that we would live with that reality in the forefront of our mind. Pray that you would press it into the areas of our hearts that it needs to be pressed into. to produce the responses that it needs to produce. God, forgive us where we failed you. Take us through this week with that constantly on our mind. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.